6 decades ago, legendary singer-songwriter Bob Dylan shocked an audience of moneyed liberals when he declared that he related to Lee Harvey Oswald. Yes, that Lee Harvey Oswald, who just a month before had been arrested for the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, then was murdered at Dallas police headquarters. Dylan declared at that swanky civil rights fundraiser that, quote, "I saw things that he felt in me." The crowd responded with boos and outrage. Dylan responded by pledging to stay away from political groups forever. I told the story of this controversial incident in part 1 of this series. Here in part 2, I'm going to try and decipher what Dylan meant. What things did Bob Dylan think Oswald felt? And why did he see those things in himself? And why even excavate this awkward moment? Well, I think enough was said at that fateful dinner to outline a perspective on the Kennedy assassination that stands in stark contrast to the conspiracy theory-driven way that many of us think about it today. So, here goes. Who was Philip Abbott Luce? In Dylan's speech at the Emergency Civil Liberties Committee, he praised a man named Philip Abbott Luce. Luce traveled in far-left Maoist circles. He was also the editor of the committee's newsletter Rights, and he was under indictment for leading group trips to Cuba in 1963 and 1964, when relations between Cuba and the USA were, to put it mildly, very bad. Quick refresher. In 1961, the USA tried to covertly overthrow Cuba's Marxist government. In 1962, World War III almost broke out when the Soviet Union began installing nuclear weapons on the island. And here, in 1963, was Luce, a self-described Fidelista, running guided tours of Cuba, complete with meetings with Castro himself, plus Che Guevara as a bonus. Bob Dylan told his stunned audience that night that, quote, "I accept this award on behalf of Philip Luce." I think that says something about Dylan's political perspective at the time. Why have we forgotten this event? Dylan's comments surface here and there in documentary films and various magazine articles and websites, but for the most part the incident is forgotten. It's hard to pin down exactly why, but I think one reason is because his speech, which literally credits Oswald for Kennedy's death, doesn't fit very well into what has become the popular explanation for the Kennedy assassination, that it was orchestrated by the national security state. Not long after Kennedy's successor, Lyndon Johnson, escalated the war in Vietnam, a wave of nostalgia for Kennedy swept across the USA. The myth that Kennedy planned to get the U.S. out of Vietnam and even end the Cold War, and that the national security state executed him for that reason, became the mainstay of films like Oliver Stone's movie JFK and a stream of conspiracy theory books and documentaries. The radical journalist Alexander Cockburn rebuffed these theories in an eloquent 1991 review of JFK. The real JFK, Cockburn wrote, presided over a vast military buildup, backed a military coup in Guatemala, denied the Dominican Republic the possibility of land reform, helped promote a devastating cycle of Latin American history, and backed a coup in Iraq. JFK presided over Operation Mongoose, inflicting terror upon Cuba. Even as bullets brought JFK's life to its conclusion in Dallas, a CIA officer operating firmly within the bounds of JFK's policy was handing poison intended to assassinate Fidel Castro to a Cuban agent in Paris. What is it that we can't accept? Since most of us still cannot accept this version of John F. Kennedy, we understandably reject the possibility that Lee Harvey Oswald assassinated him in part because Oswald held Marxist, anti-imperialist views. But he did hold those views. He did single-handedly run a Fair Play for Cuba group in New Orleans for a spell, and even traveled to Mexico to try to get to Cuba himself. To a generation of leftists and liberals in the early 1960s, just recovering from the aftermath of McCarthyism, Senator Joe McCarthy's insistence that communists had taken over the U.S. government, this narrative that a leftist killed John F. Kennedy was completely unacceptable. And if we, half a century later, still can't accept it either, we'll just have to scratch our heads at Dylan's speech, write it off as an outburst of youthful exuberance, and not consider the possibility that all he was saying at that moment, at that fateful fundraising event, was that he rejected violence, but Kennedy's oppression of Cuba had to be stopped. Perhaps for starters through dialogue, like people going to the island and talking to Cubans, rather than trying to secretly kill them. That's what I think Bob Dylan was getting at. That's all. That's my theory.